Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking in with this week's recorded lecture. We're covering a variety of topics that I'm going to try to connect, and hopefully you're making connections with these texts and the other clip that you're watching about free press. So this week, we're continuing our conversation about the criteria that makes a democratic community or society, and what that looks like in large-scale democracies, such as what we see in local and state and even federal level governments. We'll also delve into the importance of democratic education, continuing the work of Dahl, but also in the work of bell hooks, specifically how democratic education can be integrated into our own leadership development and as ourselves as educators. We'll then end with some brief points about free press, social media, and how it is being threatened in another democratic nation, the Philippines. As we learned and discussed last week, Dahl outlines 5 criteria for democracy. We talked about effective participation, as seen in the left-hand column, among all individuals in a community, that their votes all count equally when deciding on a policy, and that they have enlightened understanding, access to all information and viewpoints about various policies, control of the agenda, and that there is an important principle of inclusion of all adults in the process. It's useful to think of these criteria as goals that we work towards in an ideal democracy. However, we know that ideal democracies will never exist. Yet as democratic leaders and educators, we constantly strive toward it. As many students have noted, including myself, how are we supposed to advance these criteria in a large-scale democracy, like our local government, at the state level, and even nationally? Is it possible to reach consensus and make sure that all Americans have access to the political agenda at the federal and local level? Robert Dahl outlines how these criteria on the right-hand side play out on a larger scale. First, large-scale democracies typically have a system of elected officials. Elected by citizens through free and fair elections, elected officials are chosen to participate in government decisions. They're paramount to democratic governments and or bodies that are representative. Second, in free, fair, and frequent elections, elected officials are chosen by the citizens. And these elections are necessary to offset authoritarian power, where power is universally held by a few without the consent of the citizens. Third, citizens have the right to express themselves, the freedom of expression, without fear of severe punishment by the government. This includes our own right to dissent, which is central to a thriving democracy. When we dissent, we freely criticize our elected officials and political leaders without fear of repression by our own government. However, it's important that we must delineate our dissent, from facing criticism from our peers. On college campuses, student activists at Berkeley and other campuses, for instance, have criticized other student groups and senior leadership for inviting known white nationalists and far-right politicians to campus, advocating and advancing a critique that their politics threatens the safety of people of color on campus. This open critique, the protests that ensue, often there's a misconception that student activists are violating the free speech of these visitors to campus. However, using Dahl's democratic concepts, this is not a violation of free speech or expression, but rather holding peers accountable. When we talk about the violation of free speech or freedom of expression, that violation happens at the hands of government, not our own peers. In addition to the freedom of expression, Dahl emphasizes the fourth aspect of a large-scale democracy, which includes associational autonomy, or the formation of independent associations or organizations whose aims are to advocate for political issues in the public square. These types of associations and organizations help educate citizens about political issues. And last, and this is a really important principle, which is inclusive citizenship. Inclusive citizenship occurs in thriving democracies because they provide citizenship to all adults residing in the society. Now, this type of citizenship gives them the right to participate in elections, freedom of expression, participation in political associations and organizations. However, Dahl's principle of inclusive citizenship also calls into question the ways in which our society treats undocumented communities and DACA recipients. Dahl would argue that as a society, we move away from our democratic ideals when we deny adults in our society the right to participate fully in our democracy, when we restrict citizenship. While we know the criteria for what sustains a healthy democracy, we must also recognize that democracies have given way to authoritarianism frequently in the 20th century. Dahl outlines 5 conditions that have helped democracies remain stable, and I'll outline a few of these from the readings. First, elected officials who truly represent the civilian population, they are the ones who control the military and law enforcement, such as the police. Military and leaders within police have to defer to the decisions of elected officials because those represent the interests of the civilian population. Second, Dahl outlines that there must be a commitment to democratic beliefs and political culture. These democracies take seriously the commitment to equality, free and fair elections, enlightened understanding, and inclusive citizenship. Last, Dahl outlines that stable democracies have had what he calls weak subcultural pluralism, that is a homogeneous culture and society. Now, that section of the reading can be a very troubling section to read, especially since we live in a multicultural society. And we also live in a society with a troubled history of race relations, white supremacy, and anti-democratic institutions. While it isn't clear if Dahl thinks a diverse society is a barrier to democracy, he does outline ways in which diverse democratic societies have utilized oppressive systems to ensure temporary stability in the society. This includes how democracies like ours have often used assimilation techniques, as we've seen in our school systems historically, forced resettlement, how our government has marginalized Native American tribal communities, and violence, which we've seen in our own colonial and imperialist agenda throughout the world. All of these to bring about a sense of societal stability. This has assured democracy for only a small class of Americans historically, while failing to open democratic processes to a large segment of our society. In our history, this exclusion process has included women, the Black community, LGBTQ plus folks, Native Americans, people of color, immigrants, people with disabilities, undocumented individuals, and other marginalized communities. As many feminist scholars would argue, our nation's diversity is wealth, rather than a barrier to a healthy democracy. But how can we do this in our own context, in our own communities? This brings to mind the need for our society to engage in a collective dialogue about what it takes for a diverse society to sustain a healthy democracy. Thinking about how we create a thriving democracy comprised of diverse communities, nationally, at the state level, and even in our local governments is a very overwhelming thought for many people. This is made even more overwhelming in the context of our own democratic society right now. For instance, our society is facing political polarization in our elections, Republicans, Democrats, and the ways in which public health has been viewed along partisan lines in our COVID pandemic. The ongoing national struggle with how our major institutions, such as schools, government, financial, and so forth, have excluded Black communities historically and people of color. In reading Bell Hooks, How We Create a Democratic Community can begin in our classroom. And a classroom can have multiple meanings. In addition to the traditional classroom that we're all accustomed to on a college campus, a classroom can be your local advocacy group, it could be your family, a gathering of students at a local coffee house, on a Zoom call, and so forth. We can create teaching and learning spaces inside and outside the classroom, and this happens constantly throughout our lives. As democratic educators and leaders, conversations are at the core of democratic leadership and education. We, as democratic leaders and educators, have the ability and capacity to open up a space for learning for everyone and work against authoritarian models of teaching and learning and undo the forces of domination, such as racism, sexism, classism, ableism, in the ways in which we treat each other and dialogue with one another in these spaces. And that begs me to sort of ask the question for myself and also maybe for some of you, are we leading or educating in a way that perpetuates these forces of domination? All the while, as democratic educators and leaders, we must be committed to what Bell Hooks calls radical openness. Radical openness requires us to be willing to change our minds as we are exposed to new information constantly as we're engaged in these conversations. When we are radically open, we deepen our knowledge of issues such as police brutality, Black Lives Matter, the current elections, and rather than pick from two polarized sides that are overly simplified, we must think about issues in complex ways and make decisions that advance equality and pushes against forces of domination. In the end, what we learn from bell hooks, or what I learn at least, is that the learning process is lifelong, and the process of learning is an end in itself. Learning is not just a means to jobs and class mobility, because this dynamic does not also push against forces of domination. Now that we've covered Dahl, bell hooks, democratic education, all of these sort of concepts about democracy, we must shift to what is happening now to an important feature of democracy, which is freedom of the press. This ensures that we have an enlightened understanding and a critical understanding for our government, our elected officials, and political issues. This week, we're looking to the example of the Philippines, where there's a proliferation of social media that's even deeper than what we see here in the US. About 100% of Filipino adults utilize Facebook to gather information about politics, according to a local survey. Hence, the original promise of social media, which was to provide even more access to information for Filipinos in a democracy, is actually not happening. Unfortunately, in the story of Filipino journalist Maria Ressa, we learn that the fake news and disinformation has proliferated social media in the Philippines. This threatens their society's enlightened understanding or views of truth. In addition, fake news has colluded with a rising authoritarian government that seeks to deploy fake news on social media to suppress dissenting political opinions, which we learned earlier is the bedrock of a thriving democracy, dissent. As you watch this film, I encourage you to think about Dahl's democratic criteria and bell hooks' education, democratic education concepts, as well as think about potential similarities with and differences from our own American context. After seeing this recorded lecture, I also invite you to see the 60 Minutes video, which is also posted on Canvas in our page, to learn more about the story of Maria Ressa and the ongoing challenges to free press in the Philippines.